My name is Myra Andis, and I was 32 years old when my sister's fiancé made the biggest mistake of his life. It happened on a warm June evening inside the Sterling family mansion in Chester County, Pennsylvania, during what was supposed to be a beautiful engagement dinner between two families. The Sterling estate looked like something from a magazine: marble floors, crystal chandeliers, expensive paintings, and luxury cars filling the circular driveway outside. Every corner of the house was designed to impress people, but no amount of money can hide what people truly are. And by the end of that night, I knew exactly what kind of family the Sterlings really were. My mother, Eliza Andis, arrived wearing her favorite denim jacket and a navy blouse she had once worn to my law school graduation. She had ironed the jacket twice before leaving the farmhouse because she wanted to look respectable. My mother spent most of her life working on our 4 to 7 acre farm in Berks County after my father died suddenly from a heart attack years earlier. She raised my younger sister Hannah and me by herself through freezing winters, financial struggles, and endless hard work. Yet she never complained once her hands were rough from decades of farm labor. Her back carried years of sacrifice, and her pride was stronger than anyone I had ever known. But the Sterling family looked at her as if she were something beneath them. They smiled politely, but I could see the judgment hidden behind their eyes. The moment we walked through the front door, Trent Sterling's mother complimented my mom's jacket in the kind of fake sweet voice wealthy people use when they want to insult someone without sounding rude. His father shook my mother's hand while staring at her calloused fingers just a little too long. They acted welcoming, but every word felt carefully chosen to remind us that we did not belong in their world. I had already suspected something was wrong long before that dinner. I worked as an agricultural land use attorney in Reading, Pennsylvania, and for 8 years I had spent my career helping small farmers protect their land from greedy developers and dishonest contracts. The first time Hannah brought Trent home during Thanksgiving, I noticed the way he kept asking questions about our property. Instead of learning about our family, he wanted to know about the North Pasture Access Road, whether utility lines had ever been surveyed near the farm, and if certain sections of the land had clear titles. Most people would have thought he was simply making conversation, but I knew exactly what those questions meant. They were the kinds of questions developers ask when they're trying to estimate future land value. From that moment on, I quietly started investigating him. Over the next 6 months, I pulled property records, traced shell companies, examined LLC filings, and connected names that most people would never notice. What I found terrified me. Several limited liability companies connected to the Sterling Development Group were registered through the same Reading post office box. Hidden land acquisitions were taking place around nearby farmland. County officials connected to zoning approvals appeared in photographs with Trent's father. Every piece of evidence pointed toward one conclusion: the Sterlings were planning something big involving rural farmland, and somehow my family's property was part of it. Still, I stayed quiet because Hannah was deeply in love with Trent. She believed he was different from the selfish men she had dated before. She believed he respected her, admired her intelligence, and wanted to build a future with her. Watching her fall in love while secretly building a legal case against her fiancé nearly tore me apart, but I needed proof before destroying her happiness that night at the mansion. However, everything changed during cocktails on the terrace. I stepped inside looking for the downstairs bathroom and accidentally overheard Trent talking to one of his groomsmen behind a decorative folding screen near the wet bar. Trent had clearly been drinking. His voice was careless and arrogant. He laughed while mocking my mother, calling her trailer park trash, and joked that Hannah had been lucky to clean herself up before college. His friend laughed with him, while Trent continued insulting our family like we were some embarrassing obstacle standing between him and something he wanted. Then he said the sentence that made my blood run cold. Yeah, well, 12 more months. That single sentence connected everything. Hannah had known him for 8 months, and the wedding was planned for 6 months later. 12 months total. He had a timeline, a plan. This relationship was never about love. It was about waiting long enough to secure something valuable. When I returned to the terrace, I found my mother standing alone beside the fire pit, holding a glass of untouched seltzer water. Her face had changed. She had not heard every word Trent said, but she had heard enough laughter and whispers to understand she was being mocked. She quietly told me she wanted to wait in the car, but I gently held her arm and told her not to leave because I already had a plan. She looked at me for several seconds without speaking. She trusted me completely, even without knowing what I meant. That hurt more than anything else. During dinner, the Sterling family continued revealing themselves. Without realizing it, Trent's father raised a toast about how the two families and their Properties would grow together for many years, not lives, not futures, properties. Even Hannah seemed shaken by the wording throughout the dinner. I caught her staring at Trent with growing uncertainty, as if she were finally seeing cracks in the perfect image she had created in her mind. By the end of the evening, her smile had disappeared completely. After the dinner ended, my phone buzzed. While we walked toward the valet stand, Hannah had texted me. 3 words. "We need talk." I told my mother to wait in the car and walked toward the catering area behind the mansion. A few minutes later, Hannah appeared barefoot, carrying her high heels in one hand, her makeup beginning to smudge around her eyes. She looked exhausted, confused, and heartbroken all at once. Without even saying hello, she whispered, "I think Trent doesn't love me." Hearing those words nearly broke me because I knew how much courage it took for her to admit them. I finally told her the truth. I admitted that I had been investigating Trent for 6 months because I believed he and his family were trying to manipulate her into gaining access to our farmland. I explained the shell companies, the suspicious land records, the hidden business connections, and the reason Trent kept asking questions about the property. Hannah stood there in silence while freezer trucks hummed in the background and wedding guests laughed somewhere far away inside the mansion. The life she thought she was building was collapsing around her. Piece by piece, I told her I had stayed quiet because I needed enough evidence to expose them completely, and because I knew that if Trent suspected I was investigating him, he would move faster and cover his tracks. For a long time, Hannah said nothing. Then she looked at me with tears filling her eyes and asked the question I had been waiting months to hear. "What do we do now?" And that was the moment the real plan finally began. Nobody else at the dinner noticed the small details, but Hannah did. After I pointed them out, I told her about the strange questions Trent had asked our mother months earlier regarding the North Pasture Access Road, and whether utility surveys had ever been done near the eastern side of the property. I explained how unusual it was for a man supposedly in love to spend more time asking about land access than about family memories. Then I told her about the photograph hanging in the Sterling mansion hallway. Whitfield Sterling Sr. standing beside County Commissioner Earl Mallister outside the courthouse. To most people it looked harmless, just 2 wealthy men shaking hands at a public event. But to me it looked like leverage. Earl Mallister had approved multiple land use permits over the past 2 years, including several connected to development companies hidden behind LLC names. As I spoke, Hannah's expression slowly changed. The sadness and confusion on her face began draining away, and something colder replaced it. Her shoulders straightened, her eyes hardened. She looked less like a heartbroken fiancé and more like someone finally seeing the battlefield clearly for the first time. Then she shocked me completely. "I still want to walk down the aisle," she said quietly. I stared at her, thinking I had misunderstood what I asked. She looked directly at me and repeated it. "I want him standing at the altar. I want his parents sitting in the front row smiling at everyone. I want every single person they know there." When this falls apart, for a second I forgot she was my little sister, the gentle one, the quiet paralegal who hated confrontation and apologized when other people bumped into her. But in that moment I realized she had inherited more of our mother's strength than I ever understood. That's a dangerous amount of room for something to go wrong, I warned her. Hannah looked toward the parking area where our mother sat, quietly waiting in the passenger seat of my Ford Escape, probably pretending not to cry in front of strangers who thought money made them important. "That's exactly the point," Hannah said. Then she added something that made me realize she had already chosen her side completely. "Myra, I'm a paralegal. I know how to photograph documents." The wedding was still 6 months away. 6 months meant time to gather proof, build a timeline, expose the entire operation, and destroy them publicly instead of privately. I nodded once. "Okay," I said. "Then let's build." The drive home to the farm that night felt longer than usual. My mother sat quietly beside me, watching moonlight slide across the cornfields and old fences outside the windows. She didn't ask what Hannah and I had discussed behind the catering trucks. She didn't ask whether Trent had insulted her. She already knew enough. I had known my mother my entire life, and I recognized every kind of silence she carried. This one was different. This was the silence of a woman waiting to hear how much danger her family was truly in. About 15 minutes into the drive, I finally spoke. "Mom," I said carefully, "earlier tonight you said you'd rather lose the dinner than fight rich people." She slowly turned her head toward me. "Yes," she answered softly. "I meant it." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "We're not fighting them because they embarrassed us." I said, "We're fighting them because they want the farm for a long moment." She didn't respond. The road climbed through the dark Pennsylvania hills while old barns and silos passed by in silence. Finally, she whispered, "What do you mean?" I wanted to tell her everything right there: the shell companies, the hidden property records, the planned highway expansion, the estimated land profits. But I wasn't ready yet. I still needed more evidence. "I'll explain soon," I told her. "But until then, I need you to do one thing for me. Smile at the bridal shower, smile at the rehearsal dinner. Don't say a word about tonight to anyone. Especially not to Trent or his family." She looked out the window again and nodded. "Once I trust you," she said. That trust nearly broke me. It came from decades of shared life, from mornings in our farmhouse kitchen before school, from nights after my father died, when she sat beside me holding my hand until sunrise, from every sacrifice she made so Hannah and I could have better lives. As we turned onto the gravel driveway leading to the farmhouse, she spoke one final time. "Your father would have liked you tonight." I blinked hard at the windshield and forced myself not to cry. There would be time for grief later. For now, there was work to do. The next morning, I sat alone at my kitchen table in reading, with coffee growing cold beside a thick manila folder filled with documents I had spent months collecting. My father had died in 2014 at only 56 years old after suffering a heart attack while splitting firewood beside the barn. Everything. He owned the farmhouse, the maple trees, the barns, and the 47 acres of farmland his father had purchased back in 1948 passed to my mother. That farm was not just land, it was our history. My grandfather bought it for $94 an acre after returning from the war. My father spent his life protecting it. My mother kept it alive after losing him. Every fence post, every field, every maple tree held memories of our family. My mother earned barely enough money to live comfortably. She sold produce boxes to local families during the summer and maple syrup during the winter. She drove a 2007 pickup truck and heated the house with wood because she refused to waste money. She never cared about wealth. She only cared about staying on the farm until the day she died. But according to the documents spread across my kitchen table, the Sterling family saw the property very differently. One filing from the Pennsylvania Bureau of Land Records showed that a company called Heritage Acres Holdings had quietly filed a notice of interest on land bordering my mother's eastern fence line. Only months earlier, the parent company behind it traced directly back to Sterling Development Group. That was when the timeline finally became clear. Trent met Hannah shortly before the land filing. He proposed quickly. The wedding was scheduled exactly 12 months after the relationship began, and every January, the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation publicly announced long-term highway expansion projects. If a new highway extension crossed farmland near our property, the value of nearby land would skyrocket overnight. Suddenly, Trent's timeline made perfect sense. Marry Hannah, gain access to family properties, secure control before the public announcement, then sell development rights for millions. Sunday afternoon, Hannah arrived at my house carrying deli sandwiches, her laptop, and a leather notebook. She looked exhausted but focused. We sat at the kitchen table and started organizing everything we needed to prove the full scheme. I told her we needed 4 major pieces of evidence: pre-public transportation planning documents related to the I-78 East extension, complete corporate filings connected to Sterling Development Group and its subsidiaries, voting records from Commissioner Mallister connected to land use approvals, and finally, the prenuptial agreement Trent's lawyers would eventually send her. Hannah calmly wrote everything down while eating half a turkey sandwich, like we were preparing for a routine office meeting instead of planning to destroy one of the wealthiest families in the county. Then she admitted something that made my stomach turn. Trent had already asked her to sign a power of attorney document that would allow him to handle their joint legal matters after marriage. When she suggested I review it as her attorney, he became defensive and said he didn't want lawyers inside the marriage. That alone was enough to terrify me. Then Hannah told me Trent had repeatedly asked questions about our mother's will, whether the farm would eventually belong equally to both daughters or remain tied to the estate. He pretended it was simple estate planning curiosity, but both of us understood the truth. He was taking inventory. I leaned forward and gave Hannah a code phrase. If I text you asking, "How's the centerpiece?" it means search his office. That night, photograph everything, date stamps on location services on. Hannah nodded slowly, then reached for her phone. "I already did," she whispered. She turned the screen toward me. 14 photographs appeared one after another. The first showed a manila folder opened on Trent's desk with a label reading target parcels. The next image nearly stopped my heart. It was an Aerial photograph of my mother's farm. Our eastern fields had been circled in red marker with handwritten calculations scribbled beside them. One note, estimated purchase costs at $3,200 per acre. Another, estimated highway right-of-way premiums at $180,000 per acre after state acquisition. At the bottom, someone had written a projected profit estimate. 84 million. I stared at the number over and over. The first time it looked unreal. The second time it felt like rage. The third time it became evidence. Then came the email, printed, dated 3 months earlier, from Trent to Whitfield, Sterling Sr. Subject line: update. The message read: going well, she's already attached. Mom likes the down-home angle, should be locked in by June. Hannah, was she locked in? Meant marriage. Mom likes the down-home angle referred to Rosalind Sterling pretending to bond with our mother so they could manipulate her more easily. Hannah's hand shook slightly while I read the email. I feel sick, she whispered. I looked at her carefully. Good, I said quietly. Stay angry, we need it. By that point we had motive, financial intent, fraudulent planning, and emotional manipulation documented. But to destroy people like the Sterlings, evidence alone wasn't enough. We needed federal attention, we needed corruption charges, we needed someone impossible for them to buy off. Hannah looked at me nervously. You know someone, don't you? She asked. I nodded slowly. I went to law school with someone who now works in the FBI's Philadelphia Public Corruption Unit. Hannah leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a few seconds. How long do I have to pretend to still love him? She asked quietly. I answered honestly, 8 months. She inhaled deeply, stood up, washed her hands at the sink, and turned back toward me with a calm expression I barely recognized. Then let's finish this, she said. I still wanted at the altar, and in that moment the plan stopped being an idea. It became a countdown. Late July arrived, hot and heavy over Berks County. The air smelled like cut grass and dust, and the maple trees along the back fields barely moved in the still morning heat. I drove out to the farm early to help Mom with inventory work for the syrup operation. She came out of the farmhouse wearing old field boots, faded jeans, and one of Dad's oversized t-shirts, with a clipboard tucked under her arm. Her hair was tied up loosely, strands already escaping in the humidity. For a moment, seeing her there in the morning sunlight, she looked exactly like every version of my childhood, strong, tired, uncomplaining, and steady as the land itself. Come look at the fence line first, she said. Before I could even grab my coffee from the truck, we walked east across the property, past the vegetable garden, past the old ponds where Hannah and I used to catch frogs during summer evenings, and past the rusted iron gate where my father used to stand every morning drinking coffee before starting work. The eastern fence line stretched along the back 47 acres, the same parcel my grandfather had spent years saving for after returning from the war. Near the far edge of the property, I saw 3 bright orange ribbons tied to wooden survey stakes hammered into the ground just beyond the fence. My stomach tightened immediately. The ribbons were stamped with faded black letters I recognized from county development work. Pennsylvania Department of Transportation pre-survey markings. Mom crossed her arms tightly and stared at them. I never gave anyone permission to survey this land, she said quietly. Did the county notify you? I asked. No. I pulled out my phone, instantly photographing every ribbon, every stake, every marking from multiple angles, while recording GPS coordinates and timestamps. Years of legal work had trained me to document everything before someone could claim it never existed. Those little orange ribbons were more than markers. They were proof that somebody had already begun treating my mother's land like it belonged to them. On the drive back toward Reading, I called County Commissioner Earl Mallister's office, pretending to sound casual. His secretary answered cheerfully, and when I asked whether any county-approved surveys had recently taken place near Cedar Hollow Road, she casually confirmed that a courtesy survey connected to a future state transportation review had been approved the previous month. My grip tightened around the steering wheel. Approved without landowner consent? I asked carefully. Oh yes, she replied. Commissioner Mallister handled that personally. That was the exact moment everything changed for me. Up until then, the situation had felt like a rich family trying to manipulate a marriage for financial gain, but placing state survey stakes on private farmland without owner consent crossed into something much larger. That was abuse of government power, that was trespassing backed by corruption, that was federal territory. The next step was contacting the one person I trusted enough to handle something this dangerous. Maya Caldwell and I had survived law school together back in 2014. We sat beside each other through civil procedure evidence and clinic work, while I built a small agricultural law practice, helping farmers protect Their land, Maya, went federal and eventually joined the FBI's Philadelphia Public Corruption Unit. We still exchanged holiday cards every year, but we hadn't worked together professionally before Sunday night. I sent her a short email with the subject line, "Need to buy you breakfast about a thing, not a client thing." She replied within 10 minutes, asking me to meet her the following Saturday morning at a diner in Pottstown. I arrived carrying the thick manila folder that had practically become an extension of my body over the previous months. Maya sat across from me in a back booth, ordered a Western omelet, and listened quietly while I slid the folder across the table for 15 straight minutes. She read every page. Without saying a single word, her food went cold while she studied title records, LLC filings, property surveys, printed emails, and photographs. When she reached the email, where Trent wrote, "She's already attached, should be locked in by June," Maya stopped chewing completely and reread the sentence twice. Finally, she looked up at me with the calm expression federal investigators get when they realize a case is becoming real. "Myra," she said quietly, "this is wire fraud." I nodded. "Once I know." Maya explained that the emails crossing state lines combined with the fake corporate structures and insider land planning suggested federal conspiracy and public corruption. If we could prove that Commissioner Mallister had insider knowledge of a non-public highway expansion project while coordinating with the Sterling family, the entire operation could become a federal prosecution. But Maya needed more. She told me she required 3 final pieces before formally opening a major investigation: proof of Mallister's voting history connected to Sterling development projects, the prenuptial agreement Trent planned to force Hannah into signing, and ideally direct written confirmation tying Whitfield Sterling Sr. to the scheme itself. "We'll have all 3 before November," I told her confidently. Maya leaned back slightly. "That's a lot of confidence." I met her eyes directly. "My sister is on the inside." Maya nodded slowly. Then she said something that made the entire situation suddenly feel terrifyingly real. "If you bring me enough before the wedding," she said, "I can have arrest warrants ready." That morning, August came brutally hot. One Friday afternoon, Hannah texted me from the driveway of the Sterling family's lake cabin in the Poconos, where she and Trent were spending the weekend. "Whitfield Sr. just arrived." Unexpectedly, the message read. I immediately texted back 2 words: "Eyes open." Later that night, Hannah sent another message explaining that she had been sitting on the back deck reading when she overheard Trent and his father arguing loudly inside Trent's office. The window was cracked open, and neither man bothered lowering his voice. Hannah heard Whitfield repeat the word January several times while discussing timelines and approvals. She waited quietly until both men went outside toward the dock to smoke cigars, then excused herself to the upstairs bathroom. On the way back, she stopped at Trent's office. Sitting on his desk was a locked drawer beneath a wooden humidor. The key had been left carelessly in a pencil cup nearby. Hannah later told me her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped it. Inside the drawer sat a thick manila folder labeled in black marker, I-78E/Andis/Phase 2. Hannah photographed every single page carefully before placing everything back exactly as she found it. She drove home Sunday afternoon and texted me from a highway rest stop. I have it. That night I sat at my kitchen table until nearly dawn printing all 17 photographed pages from her secure cloud upload. The first page was an internal Pennsylvania Department of Transportation planning memo marked pre-public commissioner review. Only it outlined a proposed Interstate 78 East extension cutting directly through the eastern section of my mother's farmland. The second page contained a draft purchase agreement listing Sterling Development Group as the buyer and the Andis property as the seller. Despite my mother never agreeing to sell anything, the projected purchase price was insultingly low. Pages 3 through 15 contained draft prenuptial agreements Hannah had never been shown. Page 16 outlined projected development profits after the state highway acquisition, estimated net return to Sterling Development Group, $84 million. But page 17 was the document that changed everything forever. It was a handwritten note on yellow legal paper in Whitfield Sterling Sr.'s handwriting, 4 simple words followed by a number. Earl gets 15. I stared at the page for nearly an hour without moving. That single sentence tied the county commissioner directly to a corrupt financial arrangement involving insider information and land acquisition fraud. It wasn't just evidence anymore, it was prison. Tuesday afternoon, I met Maya at her Philadelphia office, carrying the complete file: survey, photographs, land records, internal highway memos, the Sterling purchase agreement, the email chain and Commissioner Mallister's voting record from the last 3 years. Maya reviewed every document carefully in silence. The voting records alone were devastating. Mallister had voted in favor of every single Sterling-affiliated land permit, without ever disclosing that Whitfield Sterling Sr. was his first cousin. 22 approvals, 0 recusals. Maya finally stacked the pages neatly on the conference table and looked directly at me. "This is the case," she said. She began listing possible federal charges, one after another. Wire fraud conspiracy to defraud the United States Honest Services, fraud, bribery of a public official, abuse of office, and corruption conspiracy. Then she asked me a question I had secretly been thinking about for months. "How do you want to do this?" I leaned back slowly. "The wedding is December 14th, I said. 200 guests, every Sterling under one roof. Hannah at the altar, an FBI agent attending as her guest. Sheriff Holland positioned near the sacristy, and Earl Mallister arrested at his home at the exact same time." Maya watched me silently for several seconds. "You want maximum reputational destruction," she finally said. I shook my head slowly. "No," I answered. "I want the truth exposed in the exact room where they plan to bury it." After a long silence, Maya nodded. "All right," she said quietly. "Then I'll be at the wedding by September." The bridal shower arrived at the Sterling estate wrapped in fake smiles, expensive decorations, and carefully controlled appearances. Pink balloons floated above white tents while Rosalind Sterling greeted guests in a designer linen dress and diamond earrings that probably cost more than my mother's truck. Mom wore a simple navy dress we had chosen together the week before, along with the pearl necklace Aunt Beth gave her decades earlier. She looked beautiful in the honest way country women look beautiful, not polished, not artificial, just real. Rosalind greeted us with fake air kisses and a champagne glass before making another condescending joke about being surprised a farmer could clean up so well. Some of her wealthy friends laughed politely, waiting for my mother to feel embarrassed. Instead, Mom calmly smiled and replied, "I'm still a farmer. I just changed my shoes." The laughter died immediately. One woman nearby actually smiled at my mother with genuine respect. For the first time all afternoon, over the next several hours, something unexpected happened. People gravitated toward Mom. Guests asked questions about the farm, the maple syrup operation, and the CSA produce program. Hannah's bridesmaids became fascinated listening to stories about sap collection, harvest seasons, and long winters on the property. Meanwhile, Rosalind floated around the party, desperately trying to maintain control of the social atmosphere, while quietly realizing the woman she considered beneath her was naturally commanding more respect than money ever could. And watching all of it unfold, I realized something important. The Sterling still believed they were winning. They thought the wedding was moving exactly according to plan. They thought Hannah remained blind. They thought my mother was harmless. And they had absolutely no idea the FBI already had copies of every document hidden behind their smiles. By early October, the entire wedding had become a performance. None of us could escape from every dinner, every bridal event. Every smiling photograph felt like another scene in a play where only Hannah and I knew how the story truly ended. But the deeper we got, the calmer Hannah became. That frightened me. Sometimes she no longer cried after seeing Trent. She no longer asked whether we were doing the right thing. Instead, she moved through the Sterling family world with the cold patience of someone memorizing every hallway before setting fire to the building at the bridal shower, while wealthy women in pastel dresses laughed beneath expensive tents and servers carried champagne between flower arrangements larger than my mother's monthly grocery budget. Hannah quietly motioned for me to follow her upstairs. We walked separately so nobody would notice. Inside the guest bathroom, she handed me her phone without speaking on. The screen was a photograph she had secretly taken from Rosalind Sterling's writing desk. It showed the guest list for the wedding shower with handwritten notes beside several names. Next to my mother's name, Eliza Andis, Rosalind had written 2 words in blue ink. Where modest. I stared at the note for several seconds while anger crawled slowly up my spine. Even now, even after pretending kindness for months, Rosalind still saw my mother as something embarrassing that needed to be managed and softened. For public display, I handed the phone back to Hannah and quietly told her to save the image, because one day we would print it for everyone to see. Hannah didn't smile, neither did I. By then we were far past hurt feelings. This was war conducted through polite smiles and folded napkins. A few weeks later, I scheduled a meeting with Commissioner Earl Mallister under the excuse of discussing a real land easement case involving one of my dairy farmer clients. It was the perfect cover, because I had met With county officials dozens of times before for similar matters, Earl greeted me warmly in his office lobby, wearing a flannel shirt and holding a foam coffee cup, pretending to be nothing more than a small-town public servant. Pictures of his grandchildren hung on the wall behind him. For 10 minutes, we discussed routine zoning issues, while he acted helpful and relaxed. Then casually, I mentioned hearing rumors about possible Route 78 expansion plans and asked if there was any truth behind them. Because local landowners were starting to worry, Earl didn't even blink. "No rumors," he said immediately. "Nothing official. The state's quiet right now." The answer came too fast, too smooth, and right after lying directly to my face, he casually changed the subject to Hannah's upcoming wedding and complimented the Sterling family. That was the moment I knew he felt untouchable. He smiled at me the way powerful men smile when they think they are talking to someone too small to threaten them. What Earl didn't realize was that his lie had just become evidence. The lobby where we spoke had security cameras with timestamps and audio recording. I left the building, sat in my car for several minutes, and sent the exact meeting time to Maya Caldwell along with a summary of what happened. Less than an hour later, Maya texted back, "That's a false statement connected to an active federal inquiry. Add it to the file." I stared at the message for a long time. Earl Malister had just helped convict himself because he thought nobody would ever challenge him. The final piece of the puzzle arrived on October 22nd in a FedEx envelope sent directly from a Philadelphia law firm to Hannah's apartment. The prenuptial agreement. Hannah brought it to my office the next morning before Trent even realized she had received it. I sat behind my desk reading through 14 pages of dense legal language while Hannah stood silently across from me with her arms folded. Most of the document looked standard at first. Financial disclosures, asset separation clauses, spousal obligations, until I reached Section 4.2. The clause stated that within 90 days of marriage, any interest Hannah acquired in real property located in Berks County through inheritance, family transfer, or gift would automatically be assigned into a jointly held LLC controlled 51% by Trent Sterling. I reread the clause 3 times. There was the entire scheme laid out in clean legal language. If our mother died or transferred ownership of the farm, Hannah's share would legally fall under Trent's control within 3 months of the wedding. It wasn't love, it wasn't marriage, it was acquisition paperwork disguised as romance. I looked up slowly at my sister. "You are not signing this," I said immediately. Hannah nodded. "Once I already told him I'd sign it during the ceremony." I stared at her in disbelief. "You did what?" She explained calmly that Trent loved the idea because he called it a beautiful public gesture of trust. According to him, his lawyer would carry the document in his breast pocket during the ceremony so it could be signed after the vows in front of witnesses. I leaned back in my chair slowly as the realization hit me. Trent Sterling was literally planning to walk down the aisle carrying the document that would help convict him of fraud. Hannah gave me a faint smile when she saw my expression. "You scare me sometimes," she said softly. "Good," I answered. By late November, only 8 days remained before the wedding, and for the first time my mother finally broke. She arrived unexpectedly at my house one cold afternoon with shaking hands and exhausted eyes. The moment she walked into the kitchen, I knew she couldn't carry the weight anymore. She sat at my table staring at the evidence folder while tears gathered in her eyes. "I can't do it," she whispered. "I can't watch Hannah stand at an altar beside that man. I can't smile at his mother another second." She wanted to drive straight to Hannah's apartment and beg her to run before the wedding happened. I poured her coffee and finally told her everything, every document, every photograph, every email, every secret meeting with Maya Caldwell and federal investigators. I spread all 17 pages from Trent's stolen file across the table beside the survey ribbon photographs and the handwritten note reading, "Earl gets 15." Mom read everything slowly and carefully without interrupting once. When she finally looked up, the first thing she asked wasn't about the money or the corruption. "He really said I belong in a trailer park?" she asked quietly. "Yes," I answered. She folded her hands together on the table and became very still. Then she said something I will remember for the rest of my life. "Your father bought that back 47 in 1991. She said, "We ate beans for 2 years to afford it." Her voice never rose. "It didn't need to. They will not have it." In that moment, I saw the strongest version of my mother return. The woman who fought banks, county officials, wholesalers, and anyone else who tried to take advantage of her family over the years. She looked at me calmly and said, "I'll stand beside Hannah at the altar. I'll smile for every picture. And when you tell me to look toward the back of the church, I'll look." I asked her what that meant. She touched the wedding band hanging around her neck and answered softly, "That's where your father's family always said, I'll know he's there." That was when I finally cried. The rehearsal dinner arrived the night before the Wedding wrapped in fake elegance and arrogance, 40 guests sat beneath crystal lights while servers carried lobster tails and champagne through the Sterling Estate dining hall. Trent stood for a toast halfway through the evening, already slightly drunk and grinning too confidently. "To my beautiful bride and her charming family," he announced, while raising his glass. "We're excited to fold them into our portfolio." Silence hit the room for 1 second before Trent awkwardly laughed and corrected himself. "I mean family." Several guests laughed nervously, while Whitfield Sterling Sr. tried to hide a smirk behind his water glass. Rosalind touched his arm in warning, clearly irritated that Trent had almost said the quiet part out loud. Across the table, Hannah leaned forward and kissed Trent gently on the cheek like the perfect fiancé, while secretly locking eyes with me over his shoulder. Her expression never moved, calm, focused, ready. Driving home later that night, I passed the eastern side of Mom's farm and turned my headlights toward the back pasture. My stomach tightened instantly. There were now 6 orange survey ribbons instead of 3. Worse, several stakes had been hammered directly inside our property line. Actual trespassing, actual physical entry onto private land. Without consent, I parked on the side of Cedar Hollow Road, wearing dress shoes, and walked out into the freezing December grass to photograph every stake under the headlights. Coordinates, timestamps, angles, documentation, every detail mattered now. At 11:47 p.m., I sent the complete album to Maya. 6 minutes later, she replied with one sentence: "We have enough warrants signed." Tomorrow morning, I stood alone in the dark field, staring across the frozen pasture, while cold wind moved through the maple trees. After 8 months of pretending, collecting evidence, and smiling through lies, it was finally over. The next day wasn't going to be a wedding, it was going to be an arrest scene disguised as one. The morning of the wedding began before sunrise, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the world still looked normal. Birds still crossed the fields outside my kitchen window, coffee still steamed in my mug, cars still passed quietly along the road as if nothing enormous was about to happen. But by 5:47 a.m. my phone buzzed with a message from Maya Caldwell confirming that Sheriff Holland and the federal team were fully in position. That was the moment everything became real. I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and went through the checklist one final time. Maya would arrive at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church by 1:15 p.m. posing as Hannah's college friend, and plus 1 guest. Sheriff Holland and 2 deputies would wait half a mile away in an unmarked vehicle until the signal came. Earl Mallister would be arrested at his reading home exactly 5 minutes before the ceremony started, so the Sterling family would have no warning. Hannah would wear a hidden wire inside the bodice of her wedding dress, and the prenup Trent wanted her to sign would be tucked inside a velvet portfolio hidden in her bouquet bag. Every piece had been rehearsed in silence for months. Every lie the Sterlings told had slowly built the trap they were about to walk into. At 12:30, I drove to the farm to pick up my mother. She was already standing on the porch waiting for me, dressed in navy with pearls around her neck and my father's wedding band hanging from the thin gold chain she always wore when she needed strength. The winter air was sharp enough to sting my lungs as we drove toward Chester Springs. Neither of us spoke much during the drive. We didn't need to anymore. By then, words had become unnecessary. Between U.S. St. Andrew's Episcopal Church sat on a hill overlooking bare December trees and gray stone fences. The building looked peaceful, almost holy in the cold afternoon light, which somehow made what was coming feel even heavier. Inside, the church smelled like candle wax and evergreen garlands. A string quartet tuned softly near the altar, while guests in expensive coats filled the pews. Whitfield Sterling Sr. sat in the front row, checking his phone over and over again, growing visibly irritated because Earl Mallister still hadn't arrived. What he didn't know was that Earl was already in federal custody. Maya sat quietly halfway back in the church, wearing a navy dress and carrying a small clutch purse, looking exactly like an ordinary guest. When our eyes met, she gave me the smallest possible nod. Everything was in motion now. Back in the bridal suite, Hannah stood in front of a mirror, wearing a simple ivory Vera Wang gown, while bridesmaids fluttered nervously around her, adjusting flowers and smoothing fabric. She looked calm in a way that almost frightened me, not numb, focused like someone stepping into a courtroom instead of a wedding. When the bridesmaids stepped away for a moment, Hannah quietly told me Trent had personally handed her the prenup earlier that morning and reminded her to sign it after the ceremony. He had smiled while saying it, believing he had already won. Hannah lifted her bouquet slightly so I could see the velvet portfolio hidden inside the wireworks too, she whispered. Maya tested it from the parking lot. I placed my hands gently on her shoulders, and for One long moment we looked at each other through the mirror. Without speaking, then I told her I was proud of her. She nodded once, holding herself together with pure determination. Neither of us cried because too many people were watching. We had learned by then that some battles are won by staying calm while the other side underestimates you. At exactly 2 p.m. the organ began to play. The entire church rose as Hannah walked slowly down the aisle, alone, carrying her bouquet in one hand and the evidence that would destroy the Sterling family hidden inside it. She had once told me after our father died that nobody would ever walk her down the aisle except herself, and she kept that promise. Trent stood at the altar, smiling confidently, completely unaware that his father's political ally had already been arrested minutes earlier. He looked proud, victorious, like a man standing at the finish line of a business deal instead of the beginning of a marriage. The priest began reading the traditional vows about love and devotion while the church settled into silence. Then came the familiar line every wedding guest expects to hear, without consequence. If anyone here present knows any reason why these two should not be lawfully joined together, let them speak now, or forever hold their peace. The silence lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3, then Hannah turned away from Trent and faced the congregation. At first people smiled awkwardly, assuming she was emotional or nervous. Then she began to speak, and every sound in the church disappeared. Her voice carried clearly through the hidden microphone as she explained that the prenuptial agreement Trent demanded she sign would transfer control of inherited family property into a company managed primarily by him. Murmurs spread through the pews. Immediately Trent reached toward her arm, but Hannah stepped back before he could touch her. Calmly, steadily, she continued, describing the document she had found in his office. Maps of my mother's farm, projected highway expansion plans that were not yet public, calculations showing millions of dollars in profit tied directly to acquiring our land. By then, guests had begun pulling out phones to record. Whitfield Sterling Sr. stood up from the front pew, shouting for her to stop, but Hannah never even looked at him. She held up the yellow legal pad page containing his handwritten note. Earl gets 15. Then she announced to the entire church that Commissioner Earl Mallister had already been arrested by the FBI. Minutes earlier, the room went completely silent. I have never heard silence like that before. 200 people holding their breath. At the exact same moment, Hannah gently placed the paper on the altar rail and looked toward the priest with more composure than anyone else in the room. Father, she said softly, I'm sorry, but in canceling this wedding. The priest looked physically ill, but he nodded once in understanding. Whitfield Sterling Sr. suddenly lunged toward the folder in Hannah's hands, but before he could reach her, Maya stood from her pew and stepped calmly into the center aisle. She identified herself as Special Agent Maya Caldwell of the FBI Public Corruption Unit and announced the charges against Whitfield Sterling Sr. Wire fraud conspiracy to defraud the United States, bribery of a public official, honest services fraud. You could actually hear people gasping around the church as Sheriff Holland and 2 deputies entered through the side sacristy door behind the altar. Whitfield Sr.'s face turned dark red with rage. This is a wedding, he shouted. You can't do this here. Maya never raised her voice. Yes, sir, she replied evenly. We can. Then she turned to Trent. Trent Sterling, you are under arrest. The confidence vanished from his face instantly. He looked around the church wildly as deputies approached him, almost as if he still expected someone to stop it from happening. His mother sat frozen in the front pew, beneath the stained glass light, with one hand covering her mouth. Trent actually looked at her and pleaded, Mom, do something. But Rosalind Sterling finally understood there was nothing left to do. Years of wealth, influence, and manipulation had collapsed in front of 200 witnesses. In less than 10 minutes, nobody moved to help them. Nobody defended them. Guests kept recording silently on their phones while federal agents handcuffed the 2 men who had spent months treating my family like prey. And through all of it, my mother never stood up. She sat in the front pew, wearing her pearls and touching the wedding band hanging around her neck, watching quietly as the people who tried to steal her husband's land were led out of the church in handcuffs. There was no triumph on her face, no cruelty, just dignity, the kind of dignity people like the Sterlings never understood, because they had spent their whole lives confusing money with power. My mother had buried a husband, raised 2 daughters, survived winters with almost nothing, and protected that farm with her bare hands for decades. They thought she was weak, because she was kind. They thought she was small, because she spoke softly. What they never realized was that the strongest people in the room are usually the ones who don't need everyone else to know it. After the arrest, the church remained frozen in a kind of stunned silence that felt heavier than screaming ever could. Nobody knew where to look. Some guests stared at the altar, others pretended to study the stained glass windows as federal agents escorted Whitfield Sterling Sr. and Trent through the side aisle in handcuffs. Rosalind Sterling sat motionless in the front pew beneath the afternoon light pouring through the rose window, her mascara running down both cheeks in thin black lines. For the first time since I had met her, she looked small, not elegant, not powerful, just exhausted. Sheriff Holland approached her quietly and informed her that she was considered a person of interest and would need to answer questions later at the federal field office. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply nodded once, as if some part of her had known this moment would eventually come. Hannah stepped down from the altar and walked directly toward our mother, taking her hand without saying a word. The three of us stood together in the front pew while the church buzzed softly with whispers and phone notifications from guests already sending messages about what they had just witnessed. Then Rosalind was escorted past us toward the side exit. She stopped directly beside my mother. Her hands trembled around her clutch purse as she looked at Mom with the desperation of someone finally realizing money could not buy a way out of humiliation. Eliza, she whispered, voice cracking, please tell them this is all a misunderstanding. My mother did not answer. She simply looked at her calmly with those same calloused hands folded neatly in front of her. The wedding band hanging from the chain around her neck had stopped moving beneath her thumbs. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. I stepped forward instead and quietly said the sentence I had carried inside me for 6 months. My mother belongs anywhere she wants to be. You're the one being escorted out. The old stone church carried my voice farther than I intended, and every single person heard it. Rosalind blinked hard, opened her mouth as if to respond, then lowered her eyes and walked away with the deputy beside her. I never watched her leave. I only looked back at my mother. Her eyes were dry, steady, almost peaceful. She looked at me and said one word, honey. That was all, but in that single word was every year she had spent raising us, every winter she had survived alone after Dad died, every moment she had swallowed pain without complaining. The clock that started in the Sterling foyer 6 months earlier had finally stopped. The church emptied slowly after that. Some guests left immediately without speaking to anyone, desperate to escape before reporters arrived. A few of Rosalind's charity board friends quietly slipped out the back entrance, pretending not to know the family they had spent years dining beside. Others lingered in shocked silence, watching deputies escort Trent through the center aisle. His head was lowered now, his expensive suit wrinkled, his confidence gone. As he passed Hannah, he hissed something under his breath, but Sheriff Holland tightened his grip on Trent's arm before he could say more. Hannah didn't even react. She simply stood there in her wedding dress, watching the man she almost married disappear through the church doors in handcuffs. Outside, the December air hit us hard. After the heat of the crowded sanctuary, the church parking lot had already divided itself into two groups. People openly filming with their phones, and wealthy Chester County guests quietly trying to decide how quickly they needed to distance themselves from the Sterlings. Maya walked over to us beside the Ford Escape and calmly updated us on the arrests. Earl Mallister had already lawyered up Whitfield Sr.'s attorneys. We're demanding emergency meetings with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Trent was crying in the back of a county deputy vehicle. Maya looked at Hannah and told her the speech at the altar had been perfect. Hannah leaned against the car, still wearing the Vera Wang gown, mascara faintly streaked beneath her eyes, staring silently at the winter sky. She had walked herself down the aisle, and now she had walked herself back out of it stronger than before. We drove home through 47 miles of Pennsylvania back roads with the heater running high against the December cold. Mom sat in the passenger seat while Hannah stayed in the back, still wearing the wedding dress, because none of us had thought to bring different clothes. The inside of the Ford Escape smelled faintly of silk, fabric, coffee, and cold air from Mom cracking the window open halfway through the drive. For a while nobody spoke. Then Mom closed her eyes for a moment, breathed in deeply, and quietly said, "He want get the back 47 past." Tense, final, settled forever. A few seconds later, Hannah announced from the back seat that she was starving and wanted diner pancakes. That made me laugh for the first time in days, a real laugh. Mom Laughed too short, and surprised like someone rediscovering a sound, she thought she had forgotten we stopped at Hilda's Diner outside Birdsboro, and Hannah walked inside still dressed like a bride who had just abandoned a ceremony. The hostess stared for exactly 2 seconds before calmly asking whether we wanted a booth, or table. Small-town Pennsylvania has a gift for accepting strange things without asking unnecessary questions. 10 minutes later, Hilda herself came out from the kitchen carrying 3 plates of pancakes and refused to leave a bill on the table because she had already seen the story breaking across regional news channels. Before we left, one of the waitresses hugged my mother tightly near the register. That simple kindness broke something open inside me, and for the first time since June I cried without trying to stop myself. The fallout lasted almost an entire year. In February, a federal grand jury indicted Whitfield Sterling Sr. on 8 counts related to bribery, fraud, conspiracy, and public corruption. Trent Sterling was indicted separately on 6 counts and eventually accepted a plea deal after prosecutors refused to reduce the charges. Commissioner Earl Mallister resigned from office in disgrace before being sentenced for bribery and lying to federal investigators. Sterling Development Group collapsed under investigations and licensing reviews, and eventually the company restructured under completely new leadership after their CFO agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. When the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation finally announced the Interstate 78 East extension publicly in May, the route had been quietly redirected several miles north. My mother's farm was no longer included in the right-of-way acquisition zone. Reporters asked state officials why the route changed so suddenly, but the official response only mentioned alignment. Feasibility concerns. Nobody ever publicly admitted the truth behind it. They didn't need to. Everyone in Berks County already knew. Life slowly rebuilt itself after that. Hannah left everything connected to the Sterling family behind and started working full-time at my law office. That fall, she took the LSAT and scored high enough to earn admission to law school the following year. One Saturday in early spring, Mom walked the eastern fence line carrying garden shears and trash bags. She pulled every orange survey ribbon from the property one by one, cut every stake out of the frozen ground, bundled them together, and burned them in the wood stove behind the farmhouse. By planting season, the back 47 was green again. Cherokee purple tomatoes grew where survey stakes once stood. One Sunday afternoon, I drove out to the farm and found Mom in the kitchen washing tomato seedlings under the deep sink by the window. That was when I noticed the wedding band was no longer hanging around her neck. It was back on her left hand where Dad had placed it decades earlier. She told me to sit down and have pie while sunlight from the maple trees filled the kitchen. 20 minutes later, Hannah arrived carrying casseroles from her apartment, and the 3 of us ate together at the same table where our parents once sat years before. At one point, Mom looked at both of us quietly and said, "Your father would be proud of all 3 of us." But mostly Hannah, she did the brave part, and maybe that was the real truth behind everything. Not the arrests, not the indictments, not the headlines or courtroom victories. The bravest part was Hannah standing in front of 200 people and refusing to let powerful men turn her family into property. The bravest part was my mother refusing to shrink herself to make wealthy strangers comfortable. People like the Sterlings spend their lives believing dignity can be bought, inherited, or displayed through money and status. But real dignity looks different sometimes. It looks like a widow in pearls sitting silently in the front pew of a church while the people who mocked her are led away in handcuffs. Sometimes it looks like 2 daughters who quietly build a case for 6 months instead of screaming when they are insulted. And sometimes justice does not arrive loudly at first. Sometimes it arrives slowly, patiently, document by document, truth by truth, until one day it walks directly into the loudest room your enemies own and speaks for itself.